Welcome to chapter 1 of this course. In this chapter we will look at the side variations, where the side variations are very full of fun and contains many tricks that we can outplay our opponent and perhaps win an easy game. So let's start. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and d4. E takes d4, bishop c4. And in this position, there is multiple choices for black that he or she can choose from. The main lines, we will look them in different chapters, which are the bishop c5 and knight to f6. In the side variation chapters, we will look on other moves such as h6, d6, knight a5, perhaps g6, and I will leave till the end the bishop b4 move. I believe I almost faced in my career all these moves, so I actually chose, I looked into my games and saw that which moves are really being played, and of course I checked with the computer to make sure that I am not missing any important move. So after bishop c4, let's look at d6. After d6, it's very simple. We sacrificed a pawn, and now black did not fight back for this pawn. Instead, he decided to avoid any trouble, and he did not defend the pawn and just continued with his development, but closed the bishop, the way for his dark square bishop, and that's why no need to continue with our gambit. Simply we can play knight takes d4 and just continue a normal game with normal development and nice control over the center with a better pieces placement. For example, after knight f6 we can continue knight c3, and bishop e7 we castle, and a nice place for our bishop is on f4, and after knight e5 you have a choice here to go bishop b3 or bishop e2. With bishop b3 you need sometimes to be careful because you don't want to face c5 and c4, maybe putting our bishop in not a favorable position, but in this case this idea does not make us afraid. c5 we can take, bishop takes e5, d takes e5, and go back with our knight to f3. Now c4 is not supported, we are attacking the pawn on e5, and we have very good position here. Also, the control over the d5 is very important, and that's why we have the slight advantage here, because this square is really weak after the c5 push and the e5 push, and we have perfect control over this square. If you don't, of course this position will allow queen trade. If you wish to continue this position without allowing this trade, I will give you another alternative, which I always try to do in my courses. Perhaps you might like the position, or maybe you prefer, but I wish I could have kept the queens. Well, here there is an option to do that, and you can go to bishop e2 instead of bishop to b3, and the idea will be bishop to g3 and follow with f4 with a nice structure. Perhaps you can keep in mind queen d3 followed by rook a to e1, of course after the bishop g3 f4, and prepare the f5 or e5 push in the future. So this is another way to play this position. So as we saw, d6 is not really a threat or anything special about this position. It's very simple. We took our pawn back and we developed normally with a nice placement of our pieces. h6, again the same idea. h6 usually is played when the opponent is not really prepared and want to avoid any kind of attack on f7. He doesn't remember what's going on. So again, we can play with the same spirit of the d6 push. We can play knight takes d4. Black did not fight for his pawn. We happily take this one. Knight to f6. And now we can either go knight to c6 or we can go knight to c3. So here also we have an option. I will show you. Knight c3 is an option. And after bishop b4, we take on c6, b takes, and now we castle and we offer a sacrifice for the pawn. Bishop takes c3, and after b takes c3, black has an option here either to castle or take the e4 pawn. If black takes the e4 pawn, we go bishop a3, stopping the castling, and after d5, we go queen to e1. It's a hard move to remember, but it's the computer favorite move here, pinning the knight, and also preparing perhaps bishop d3, also protecting the c3 pawn. Bishop e6, bishop d3, and queen f6, and c4, pressuring the center. Black king will not be very happy standing in the center here. Another option for black is to avoid this win of the pawn and go castle. And after castle, we can go e5 and push this knight away. In general, when black does not fight for the e5 square, we like to push this knight away. And after knight d5, we can go queen to f3 and protect our pawn, put pressure. Future idea would be queen to g3, threatening bishop h6, perhaps f4 and f5. So this was a way to play this position. Let's remember, this was after knight to c3 here, and we allowed bishop to b4. If you were not a fan of this position, although in this course, and of course as a rule in a gambit, I am expecting that you are prepared to give a pawn or two for some activity like what we saw. But if you were satisfied that you won your pawn back here and you don't want to enter the sacrifice cycle again, I understand. And perhaps you can go with knight takes c6 here instead of knight c3. And after b takes c6, you can go to e5. And after e5, black needs to know what he's doing here, because if knight h7, then black is really very passive here, and we happily castle. For example, bishop c5, and now knight to d2, preparing knight to e4. Castling, knight to e4, attacking the bishop, forcing the bishop back, and now bishop to f4. We've placed our bishop again to f4, and the pawn on e5 is well protected. Also an idea with the bishop f4 to prevent any future d6 or d5 moves, so our bishop stands really well here. Also, we don't forget that our knight will have a big role in an attack, perhaps on the black king. We always have this queen f3, queen g3 idea, rook to the center, and this knight will have to stay on h7 to defend against any knight f6 checks. So we are really comfortable here. So knight h7 puts black in really passive situation. Black must play d5 here in an answer to our e5 move, and after d5 we can play e takes f6, d takes c4, and now I really like this endgame for white. Bishop to d2, g takes f6, and now we place our bishop on c3 on this strong diagonal. Black must defend his f6 pawn, and castling. We have castled. I cannot call this really a sacrifice of the pawn, because knight d2 you will get this pawn, or knight e4 you will get that pawn, rook to the center, and perhaps it's playing for a win or draw in this situation. It's really hard to lose such a game with white. So this was what we saw after the h6 move. To recap, after h6 we saw knight takes d4, and after knight f6 I gave you two options, either knight to c6 or knight to c3. So other than d6 and h6, there is knight to a5. And I remember the first time I faced this move, I don't believe I replied correctly. I was worried about my c4 bishop, because usually in this gambit, our c4 bishop plays a very important role. And in general idea, we don't want to give this bishop unless we are winning the pawn back, or perhaps a strong sacrifice. But in this case, black has wasted a lot of time with knight c6 and knight to a5, so it was actually the best move here to play queen takes d4, getting our pawn back and protecting our bishop. And after knight takes c4, queen takes c4, d6, we just develop our pieces, knight f6 and bishop f4. Again, if you notice, our placement of dark square bishop is being on f4, because it's either supporting our e5 pawn or supporting the e5 push. And after bishop e7 we can castle, and as you see, the e5 push will be very annoying for black here, and that's why it was worth to get our queen out and castle alongside, to which compensated our loss of our nice c4 bishop with a very fast development and the threat of the e5 push. So that was what's happening after knight to a5. Also, g6 is an option here, and I also have faced this this move. And after g6, we simply again take knight takes d4. So after d6, h6, g6, we always get our pawn back. Black is not trying to save his pawn. Why we should keep it? We just get this pawn back. Bishop to g7, knight takes c6. And after knight takes c6, b takes c6, castle, d6, and now, as you see, black is trying to play d6 before knight f6 to avoid the annoying e5 push. And after d6, knight c3, and now black has to choose a place for his g8 knight. It can be knight f6 or knight to e7. If knight f6, we push e5. d takes e5, we take, and now we take on f7, leaving this e5 pawn lonely, king in the center, and our rook will come to the center, and we have a nice pressure and a better pawn structure. So that's why knight f6 is not the best choice, even though black tried to support the knight on f6 with the control on the e5 square, but still it was not enough. So black can go knight e7 here, and bishop to e3, castling, and bishop to d4. As you saw in the previous lines, we were going with our bishop to f4, but in this case, with the annoying bishop on g7, I really don't like to keep his way open, and because later black can annoy us a little bit with this pressure. And playing Sicilian with myself, sometimes accelerated dragon, I know this bishop can be annoying for white. So why not to get rid of it? Bishop e3 as we saw, and bishop to d4. And if black takes, we simply take. If black doesn't take, we will take. And queen d4 perhaps is a nice square for our queen, looking on the a7 pawn, looking on the king side. Also f4, and you can, according with going on the position, you can go f5, perhaps f6, rerouting your queen to go to g7, or you can get your rooks to the center and go for the e5 push. So we have a nice position and multiple plans to think about. So this was the bishop or the g6 move. So till now we saw d6, g6, h6, and now we saw also knight to e5, knight to a5. Knight to a5 was the only move that, of course, we would not take knight takes d4 because we lost our bishop. We took with queen takes d4, and this is easy not to forget, of course, in a practical game. And let's see, bishop to e7. After bishop to e7, actually, before preparing this course, I always went for c3 here. And to be really honest, I really enjoyed playing c3 here. And I will talk about it a little bit. Perhaps you can keep it as an alternative. But my recommendation here is just take the pawn back. So, and also it will be easier for our memory to relate. Okay, so against d6, g6, h6, all these moves, bishop e7, where one black doesn't defend the pawn, we just take it back. And after knight f6, knight c3, castling, castling, d6, and bishop to f4. If you notice, we have a similar position that we saw before, and after knight to e5, when we saw that we can go either bishop e2 and bishop b3, and bishop g3 and f4. So we already saw such position before, and that's why also I recommended this move, because it's similar to positions we already saw. So you will be familiar when you're playing these positions. When the ideas are really connected, it will be easier for you to master this gambit. But if you like, another option which I enjoyed is the c3. And after c3, actually I never faced the best move here, I believe. And the best move would be knight to a5. And this position, the computer said this position is of course playable, and he suggests bishop e2, d takes, and knight takes c3. And white plays this position on with the nice initiative, but as a computer preference, it preferred knight takes d4 over that gambit. But let me give you a slight ideas in this c3. As an alternative, maybe you would like to try it, because after d takes c3, we can go queen to d5. And this idea, attacking on the f7 pawn, is really strong, because black has no way to defend this pawn except with knight h6. And please remember this position very carefully, because we will see this position with the bishop b4 alternative that I will explain later, because it is very similar, but it has a very huge difference. And don't worry, I will remind you when I reach the bishop b4 alternative or bishop b4 move. I will remind you again about this position. In this position, we really don't win like immediately or easily, because after bishop takes h6, black castles, and now black is threatening c takes b2 and our bishop. So it's not really winning on the spot. There is one move that you might think will keep the or will defend those two problems at the same time, which is bishop c1, but actually this will be a problem for white, because black can go knight to b4, and after knight to b4, the threat of knight c2, or if queen d1, to prevent that, then black can go c2, will put us in some trouble. And that's why here we have to give the piece back with either bishop takes g7, knight takes c3, or knight takes c3 immediately. But those positions are nice for white, unless you try to be greedy and protect both the bishop and the pawn at the same time. So this is really, I played many games here, and multiple times black took that pawn and fell into trouble. Another option would be d3, but this is not really fighting. And if black does not do anything special, for example d6, then c takes d4, and we are happy to take the center. So actually c3 is a nice alternative, and you could try it, but you should be prepared to play this position with a pawn down, which is really fine. And we will play similar ideas in this position, but I would stick in my recommendation to the computer preference. So this was the bishop c4. We talked about bishop e7, d6, h6, g6, and knight to a5 in this position. And we will talk about the bishop b4 in the next chapter. See you in the next chapter.